Magic they've had a crazy hard job for 30 years and have done actually really well at it.
Distraction makers.
Today we're going to talk about a design technique, I guess, called aiming the cannon.
Yes.
Which means that you design the thing with your best guess as to like what it should be and how it should work, and then you try to break it effectively. You basically take its effects and you double them, and if the ability still works or the thing that you're designing still works, you double it again.
Right.
Because you need to figure out where the ceiling is. So then you can say, okay, well, that's the maximum that we can do. So we know that this thing can be somewhere between the maximum and where we started.
Yeah.
You can go the other way too if you need to figure out where like the least powerful it can be, so that when you know that that's the range that you're working in. Yeah. And this usually you would be looking at this toward like after you've gotten a lot of stuff figured out. This is more the fine-tuning stage. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we got from the first Planeswalkers that were released in Lorwyn to Jace the Mind Sculptor, because I think this illustrates this idea almost perfectly. Planeswalkers were first introduced to us through a card called Tarmogoyf, and a lot of people know this, but
I didn't know this.
Right. If you don't know, this is how we were first introduced to Planeswalkers, is in the set called Future Sight.
Future Sight was them predicting all these future mechanics.
Yes.
Didn't they introduce like 17 mechanics or something crazy
more
like
than
that?
Yeah,
okay.
Way more than that.
Yeah. And they had like different card borders and frames and stuff.
Yep. Yeah, there was the future shifted frame, which was like, oh, here's what Magic could look like in the future.
Man, I wonder when they're going to do that.
Yeah. Still waiting. Like tons of different mechanics and ideas, and I think most of them, I don't know about, a lot of them have been introduced again at this point. So we're introduced to Tarmogoyf, and on Tarmogoyf's text says that it gets +1/+1 for each card type in all graveyards, and it lists a bunch of card types. And one of the card types that it listed is Planeswalker, and everybody went, what the heck is a Planeswalker? Because we had no idea. So the next set after that, we go to Lorwyn. And this is when the Planeswalkers are introduced. And we get the first 5 Planeswalkers, which is Jace, Liliana, Chandra, Garruk, and Ajani.
Yeah.
One for each color. And they're very exemplary of what the colors do, right? Jace draws cards. Chandra does direct damage, etc. And these cards were, to me, felt very much like trying to aim the cannon as sort of conservatively as possible, but still make these cards exciting enough that people want to play them. And I feel like they nailed this one, is they were like, okay, we can't take a huge risk here because this card type is brand new, but we also don't want to be too risk adverse because then people won't play the cards.
Right.
Okay, so eventually we get down the road and we're in the Zendikar, and then we end up in Worldwake, and this is when Jace the Mind Sculptor comes out. And to me, this is a great example of, okay, how far can we push these Planeswalkers, this new card type, until it's broken, right? So the initial Planeswalkers had 3 abilities. Jace the Mind Sculptor has 4. He's costed very aggressively. The card effects that they put on him that you can use are very powerful.
Was Jace a mythic rare?
Yes.
But the original one wasn't.
Mythic rares didn't get introduced until Shards of Alara, which was after Lorwyn.
So part of me wonders also if this was them pushing that idea of, okay, if this is the first mythic rare Planeswalker,
right?
Like, how good can this be?
How good can this be?
Yeah.
So they're experimenting, and I think obviously aiming the cannon is something that happens more internally than externally. And with Magic, it's so interesting because we can watch these design philosophies evolve over time, because you can't patch a printed card game.
You can, in a way.
Well,
there's definitely been erratas.
They've done it like one time with companions, and that was about it.
They've done it a couple other times, but I think like a great example that everyone looks back to is like the Power 9, right? Like where you look at all those very powerful initial cards, and Black Lotus being like the pinnacle of them. Obviously, people know the story. Most people know the story of like why they were printed. They weren't expected to be in everybody's deck. Right. The game went gangbusters, and everyone wanted one.
Yeah.
But they knew going into it, these are very powerful cards. This is too powerful of a card
for everyone to have.
For everyone to have
multiple
one.
copies of them. Yeah.
And I think their design intention was correct, but then once they realized how big this would be, they realized, okay, we have to bring it back now. So they knew they were aiming too far for the impact that those cards were supposed to have, but then had to reel it back moving forward because of how the game ended up evolving and how many people ended up being interested in it.
Right. And the other thing that's interesting is the context in which Jace the Mind Sculptor comes out. Is he is printed at a time where we haven't had a banned card in Standard since Affinity, which was, I think, 7 or 8 years prior. So we had a Standard environment that was very healthy. It's actually funny because the bans happened at Mirrodin and then Mirrodin again.
Oh, okay.
So that is aiming the cannon through the lens of Magic the Gathering, but this applies to all game design.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we were talking before this about like what we were going to talk about and stuff, I think that what's really interesting is that this exists in all games, right? We've been on that side of things where we've been working on a game and we're like, okay, this is a mechanic. How strong is this mechanic? So we're going to have it be really strong. And we go, okay, obviously that was too strong. So then we're going to bring it back and try and, find that sweet spot. But yeah, most games, you don't see that, or it's not like a permanent thing. And Magic has these artifacts of its time that you can look back on and be like, oh yeah, that was like a really powerful card. And I think Black Lotus is like so funny because like it's still really powerful when you look at it. Some of these cards you look back on, and depending on the format or where things are at, like we talked about how Jace the Mind Sculptor is like, it's just like an okay card. It's like pretty good, but it's not like amazing anymore.
Right. By today's standards, it's not nearly as good. But then you can see them aiming the cannon again, and we get something like Oko, right? Like, and it's this constant pushing and pulling between like, okay, we want to be able to adjust some of the power levels of these things, and we want to make players excited, and we want to kind of maybe overshoot a little bit. So that these cards, they're trying to like sort of ensure that they see tournament play, that they make players excited. Like that is part of making a trading card game. Yeah. And so you'll see these overshoots happen every so often, and you'll see undershoots happen so often.
Right. And I think it's funny because like you look at a lot of video games, and even like digital card games do this all the time, where they come out with a card or they come out with something in a video game, and it's like, yeah, we know this is like probably too strong, but you guys test it and then let us know. And then once they get a lot of data back, then they're like, okay, then we're going to reel it back. And then you might even adjust it afterwards and just constantly be moving numbers around. And sometimes numbers are moved around to even keep a meta fresh. If it's like, okay, this person's like being played really, really often in a shooter or something like that, or this card is being played really, really often in this meta, then, okay, well, we're going to adjust the numbers. And then suddenly a new card comes in. Or a new hero is the one that's being played.
Right. And the thing that used to happen in like standard Magic is that I think like they would purposely print a very powerful card, and then in the next set that's coming out, they would print a card that pulls that back in line. Yeah. Yeah. And so you'd get sort of this, what we see as like maybe a first-person shooter that's being patched constantly and things are adjusting that way. We're getting that, but we're getting it over a longer period of time, right? And it's also being done in a way that doesn't feel like something's being nerfed because there's no way to change the text on a printed card. So instead, the format around that card is changing to sort of pull it back in line, right? Okay, we aimed the cannon too high. Now we're going to print a new card to sort of pull it back in line. Yeah.
It's funny because, one, I mean, it shows how important standard is, because if something's too powerful, it's going to rotate out.
That's true.
Sometimes it's so powerful, it has to be banned sooner than that. And that's, always a possibility. But I mean, it's weird because like it exists in all games. Right. Every game does this. Most people probably look at it as like, oh, this is just game balance. Right. Which it is just game balance. But sometimes, especially in like physical game situations, like a digital game, you could have 1 million players. You have all that data constantly coming in. You could have 1 million Magic players, but how do you get the data for how Jace is being played, right? You only have tournament statistics. And so internally, they only have so much they can test this before they can really bring it out to the full audience. So it has to be really, really, really precise as they could possibly get it before they send it back out. Yeah. So even if they're aiming for it to be powerful, sometimes, yeah, they go a little too far. Right. And it gets, broken. But
I think that's also what's so fascinating about looking at Magic as like Magic's design over the years is that these are designers who are making stuff that's being printed in ink.
Yeah.
Like you cannot go back and change this stuff. You can when you have sort of rotating formats, but people are still going to play in that play environment for a long period of time before you can make adjustments. You have a release schedule. You can't go back and patch these things. So to me, it requires sort of another level of excellence almost, and the ability to create tools and ways of thinking that you can test this stuff and try to figure out what is right before it gets released. Yeah. And I think that's sort of where the internal testing that we don't see of them aiming the cannon. I'm sure this happens constantly throughout the process, as it does for us when we're working on our games, is that we're constantly saying, okay, can we make this, can we tune this up? Does it need to be taken down? We need that barometer of, okay, well, this is too much and this isn't enough. So we know the answer somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah. And I mean, they have all these different cards to aim in that middle, right? They know Lightning Bolt is like best one red mana for 3 damage. They're going to base all the other spells, all the other interactions probably around that cost and that that outcome.
Well, it depends on the standard environment too. So the Mark Rosewater at some points has talked about how the standard environment will shift between a lightning bolt environment or a shock environment.
Right.
Where do you get 3 damage for 1 red, or do you get 2 damage for 1 red? And creatures are balanced accordingly to that. So you have a waxing and a waning and a moving between the power level of spells versus the power level of creatures,
which is significantly harder to design for than many other card games that just lean straight into a power curve. And they decide every new set, all the Pokemon in this set, they all get 10 more HP. I don't know. I don't play a lot of Pokemon, but I'm just going off that. And so if everything gets 10 more HP, then as long as we make sure everything else gets an equivalent amount of a buff to that, then everything's going to be equal in a way. And Magic has really... They've had a crazy hard job for 30 years and have done actually really well at
Amazing.
It. It's
Absolutely
incredible
amazing.
how well designed the game is
right.
still to this day.